Today's lecture is on the nervous system. If we can make the slides work. Today's lecture is on the nervous system. I think it's a fun way to start by this quote on the front slide that says, "The right half of the brain controls the left half of the body. This means that only left-handed people are in their right minds." And so there's been a lot of historical play, or not play really, back and forth about right-handed versus left-handed people. And at one point people thought if you wrote with your left hand you were wrong. What we now know is that those were just kind of some weird social things going on, and that, but that there is a distinct connection between what the right half of your brain and the left half of your brain does. And it's important that we know those items as well as that we understand how brains affect animals. The central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. And as you can see in this picture, it's kind of colored gold. It goes right down the middle of the mammal's body. It acts as the body's control center. And what it really does is coordinate impulses that go through all the neurons back and forth to your brain. So your brain sends messages, but your brain also receives messages from other nerves. The rest of the nervous system, the peripheral nervous system in this picture is in green. And so you can see it comes off the central nervous system and collects information throughout the rest of the body. In addition to the central nervous system, we then can look at the peripheral nervous system. And the peripheral nervous system you can divide into two different parts. One is going to be the somatic nervous system, and one is autonomic. Now, the somatic nervous system is the one you consciously control. And so if you remember the example from class, if I walk up and I punch George in the face, that was a decision I made to activate those muscles. My brain told my arm to do it. There was information relayed between the skin to the muscles, and I controlled those pathways. The somatic nervous system does include reflexes, which are automatic response to stimuli, but reflexes really are very little if you look at all the ways a mammal's body moves. The autonomic nervous system is the way to relay information from the central nervous system to your organs, but this part is involuntary. So, for example, when you are sitting here listening to this lecture, you don't have to think in your brain, breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out. You don't have to send a message to your stomach to digest the fruit snacks you just ate, because all of that is automated in your body. We divide the autonomic nervous system into the sympathetic one and the parasympathetic. Parasympathetic controls your body in times of rest. Think sleep, right? When you're asleep, there are still things going on. And parasympathetic is when you are under stress. So fight or flight is the biggest deal. I will post this additional video for you to watch also, but it basically goes through the science of what happens in terms of the endocrine system, hormones, different things like that when you're placed in a fight or flight situation. An animal's nervous system looks very similar to a human nervous system in a lot of ways. You can see the brain and the spinal cord being the central part, and then you can see some pretty main nerves branching off of it and going to all the appendages. And it's important to know, just as like a philosophical thing, that as those go to the appendages, that's part of what controls that appendage. So if you were to, say, cut a nerve in a horse's leg, they would likely lose use of that leg until it was repaired. Now, as you go down into a much smaller, minute level of the nervous system, you notice that neurons are the basic unit and function of the nervous system, and basically the whole system is made up of impulses. So an impulse travels from one neuron to the next, to the next, to the next, and it makes a pathway. You'll see that in this picture of a neuron, which I'd like for you to kind of translate to your notes, specifically labeled at one end where the cell body is, has little things growing off of it called the dendrites. And then there's kind of a long skinny part called the axon, and the axon terminals are at the other end. The axon terminals of one neuron then attach to the next dendrite, and so it can become kind of a chain. If you have a message being sent along from neuron to neuron and it doesn't connect or it doesn't continue on, then there's a pretty major problem in that mammal's body. So the dendrite end is the one that receives impulses and carries them to the cell body. The axon end carries the impulses away from the cell body. Now, it's not quite as simple of a chain as I make it up to be, because it's not like one neuron is only attached to one neuron. They really create more of a web, if you will. And so, for example, if we go back to the video you watched about the guy almost getting hit by a car, that stimuli of getting hit by a car activates a whole bunch of things in your body. There's a lot going on at any given time in the central nervous system. And so you could even think about it like a highway system, maybe the one in Denver where all the major interstates meet that they used to call the mousetrap. That's kind of what's going on in your body all the time. On this slide, you can see at the top a picture of a neuron, but what I really want you to record is that there are three main types of neurons. So not all of them are made the same. They all do different things well. The first type is a sensory neuron. This takes all the stimuli from around you and takes it to your brain and spinal cord, and it makes your brain then kind of makes some sense of it, like, oh, I feel cold, and so I should react by putting my coat on. Next, we have interneurons. Those are found within the brain and the spinal cord, processing incoming impulses and passing them on to the motor neurons. And then the motor neurons actually send a message out to your body to act. So the three types of neurons work together all the time. They take in a message, they process it, and then they carry it away. So if we use another example, similar to how, the joke of me punching George in the face, let's say I go up and tap Macy on the shoulder. I'm too scared of her to punch her in the face. The first thing that will happen is sensory neurons in her shoulder will transmit that touch message to the information will be sorted in her brain. The interneurons will tell the motor neurons, hey, someone would like to talk to you, turn around. And then the motor neurons will help her move the muscles in her body to react. All of this happens so fast. And so while I talk about it in a very slow manner, it happens all the time. And because it's happening all the time, sometimes our outside stimuli is actually interpreted incorrectly. And so your nervous system has a lot of pieces and parts to it, and occasionally the brain has to stop and process more to get it right. This is the very micro level of how an impulse is transmitted. When something happens to you, you see something, you feel something that turns on or excites a sensory neuron. And then there's this wave of changes that go kind of down an axon. And from one little neuron to the next is a little gap. And so all those impulses can hop across the gap. And with the help of neurotransmitters, the messages move around really fast. The picture at the bottom is actually picture of neurons. See how interconnected they are. This is in the cerebral cortex of a hamster. Hamsters are not known to be the most brilliant animal in the universe, but even in an animal that small that's not considered very smart, there's a lot of neurons happening. Now, we would be remiss if we didn't also talk about the brain of the mammal. In the brain of the mammal, there are three main sections, and depending on the animal, not all those sections are the same size. We're going to begin by talking about the human brain, and we divide it into the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. So you'll want to jot those three words down in your notes, and maybe just a quick phrase about what they actually do. We'll start with the brainstem. The brainstem is probably the part that all animals share in common, because if we don't have a brainstem, we're typically not alive. It's what controls all your involuntary actions, such as breathing, digesting, growing. You know, if your brain tells you to stop breathing, you're not alive for long. Then we're going to work from the bottom. So the one in the middle there is called the cerebellum. Look on the chart where you see the cerebellum. This is in the lower part of your brain, kind of behind the brainstem. It controls your balance, your posture, and your coordination. Just like any other part of the brain, every person's brain has different capabilities. For example, I'm not very coordinated, and so I'm not a great basketball player. But if I wanted to develop that talent, I could do tasks to strengthen my cerebellum and have better posture, better balance, remember which basket to throw the ball at, things like that. And then the bigger part of the brain, that top section, is called the cerebrum. And it's actually divided into two hemispheres that we call the cerebral hemispheres. This is what controls your ability to learn things in this class. It controls your memory. It's what we call intelligence. It actually controls and helps you move your muscles. And so that's where we talk about the right brain and the left brain. The right brain, typically in humans, is linked with creativity, is linked with activity and things like that, while the left brain is linked with logic and things like math. Now, people who study brains really take this a million steps further. And so if you take a look at this cerebrum picture, you can see that even within it, different parts or different lobes control different things. And if you were to actually look at it, there's actually, the tissue is this wrinkled mass with countless folds and grooves, and that's actually where stuff is stored. And so you just think I'm weird, but I really do say that it's part of the deal when you study is that you have to bring some things out to the front of the folds of your brain so you can recall them faster. I always like to start with the frontal lobe because sometimes teenagers are busy working on growing their frontal lobe, and maybe that's why some of your friends make bad decisions or don't know how to solve problems well, or plan ahead, all of those sorts of things. Your parietal lobe is where you process sensory information, and then you can see that at the back of the brain, the lobe is concerned with vision, and right kind of in the front at the bottom, that's the part of your brain that deals with memory, emotion, hearing, and language. When a person studies brains of humans, it's a pretty intense science. Neuroscience is really a cool topic. We don't actually study animal brains to quite that extent, but many of the parts are the same. I would say the biggest difference is probably the size of the frontal lobe. So, for example, your dog may not have the same size frontal lobe as you do. Now, the cerebellum, remember cerebellum, if we go back to our first picture, is at the back, kind of right near the brainstem. It's in conjunction with muscle memory and your physical skills. And so when you injure your cerebellum, your movements become a little bit jerky. And on the flip side, when you see a very well-coordinated athlete or a jumping horse, that is going to be the cerebellum that is very well trained. The important thing to remember is that brains are a muscle, and they must be worked. And so just like you work out your legs, if you work out your brain will get stronger. Okay, next we do the brainstem. The brainstem is made up of the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. The brainstem is sometimes called the reptilian brain because it resembles the entire brain of a reptile. So reptiles don't have all those different parts to their brains, and instead they just have the reptilian brain. Basically, your reptilian brain keeps you alive. It helps you get away from predators, it makes you breathe, it tells your organs to digest your food, but not so much thinking about math or philosophy. Now, there are nervous system diseases that can affect humans and do in a big way. Here's a list of them. We also see some affecting animals, so that's important to note as well. Oftentimes there are nervous system problems that affect animals that we'd never diagnose because of the cost involved. Thanks for your time and attention today. Have a good one.